I want to ask each of the four panellists now to do the impossible. I want them to look into their crystal ball and look 10 years into the future and to see what the whole issue of cash will mean for humanitarian aid by the year 2027. And what do they think it will look like? And particularly to think for a second about what will the role be for international NGOs, or will there be a role for international NGOs within this sphere? So with that in mind, does anybody want to go first on that one?
Can the student pass this one?
Yeah, you.
No, I'm keeping my neutrality in here.
I don't mind doing it because I could try and weave in what I was going to say.
Okay,
yeah.
so do you want to go first, and then we'll gives everybody else a chance.
It'll be a cheat because I'll say what I was going to say in answer to the previous question. But I think I haven't thought this through in much depth, so I'm excuse me. But what we've just been discussing now is a real tension between this idea of cash at scale, using existing social protection systems, using the capacity of large international organizations, primarily the UN, to strengthen capacity of states. And I think that is a very viable and aspirational model in certain contexts, as long as there is some diversity maintained in terms of the expertise of, say, humanitarian NGOs, local and international, in contributing to that. I still think that is a certain subset of the types of contexts in which we operate, and I think that unfortunately the trends that we're observing around us and this process. I'm going to quote some words from a lady called Jennifer Welsh, who's a professor at Oxford, and she spoke at our Global Cash Forum as well. And she made a very compelling speech, and she spoke about this process of de-democratization, the idea that both the demand side of humanitarian assistance is continuously increasing, but then the supply side is becoming more and more erratic and less predictable, and principles being breached and so on. And so in those fragile states where that process is underway, and without that security of supply of humanitarian assistance, I think then cash programming might play a very different role, and there it might be a lot more about let's support local initiatives in whatever way that may be. So whether that's local civil society, or whether it's whatever forms of survival people are using to stay resilient in those kind of situations. And I think those are two quite different models, and I think we need a system that's kind of equipped to deal with both, and I think cash has the potential to contribute to both.
Yes, I thought about this a little bit last night, and my answer was it's quite hard to make this kind of prediction. If we were to predict 5 years ago that we would be doing this level of cash, I would have sort of started shuddering, thinking that's absolutely not possible. We're still growing incrementally and so on. So I say this partly because I think there's various elements that are going to play into that equation. One, I think that the numbers that you showed, Isabel, are indeed, we think that or certainly I think that there's scope for the use of cash to be increased. I think that scope is there, and I think the scope for that is going to be more and more prevalent. I think technology is going to make that possible. What I'm quite flummoxed about is this whole humanitarian world, which is at the moment in flux. And how is all of this going to pan out is in the world of politics, where I understand very little. But I can see that there are these tensions, and I can see that this is coming through on things like new donor initiatives, new ideas, all of which I think we need to be open-minded about and willing to embrace. But part of what makes me worry is that sort of cash has been anchored with this. Cash is the reason why we need to reform the humanitarian sector. And Isabel would have heard me say this before, but I'd like cash to be able to be let cash continue to do what it can do because it's a very useful tool. take the politics and the reform of the UN and the reform of the humanitarian system, have that discussion separately, because cash, if you may think of it as a CSB, corn soy blend plus. It's just another commodity that we can use in certain circumstances that can help us achieve certain objectives. So my bottom line is, it's very hard to see how this is going to go. I would certainly like to see more and more of cash, and I would certainly like to see more and more government, as I've been saying, more government ownership of their own countries.
Okay, great. Linda, I'll give that one to you now.
Well, I was planning to let this one pass as the student, and I was willing to listen to the experts. But 10 years from now, I think she just took the words out of my mouth when she talked about the demand and the supply. Definitely the demand is increasing, and it's going to get worse, fueled by everything else, the political situations, climate change. 10 years from now, it's going to be tricky. So if we don't look at sustainability of all these cash transfer programs, a lot of it is donor driven. In country, a lot of it would be tax financed. The tax bases are shrinking. If you look at it from the African context, there needs to be a lot of out of the box thinking when it comes to sustainability, especially in financing the cash transfers, because there's also the aspect of dependency that will come out of it. I looked at the program. Most of the people, a good number of the people I interviewed had been under PSNP for more than 10 years, or 2 to 3 phases of the program. Yet poverty is not, if you look at Amartya Sen's theory of poverty, whereby it's not a stock, it's a flow. People come in and out of poverty. But if you're having people staying put and benefiting from the program continuously for 3 terms, what is that saying about the new people that are falling in and out of poverty? So that also needs to be looked into. And then I would think from an African point of view, again, to consider the role of social, I don't know what to call them, social networks, family and social networks as a form of social protection. And how can this be, and that will tie on to remittances. For most African countries, remittances are probably the 2nd or 3rd largest contributor to the overall GDP anyway. So how are these factoring into, because people would have relatives in the field who would be poor, but they're getting remittances from people on the other side. So how do we fit households that are benefiting from remittances from 1 or 2 household members that have succeeded within this other entire framework? So I guess when it goes back to targeting and the role of social networks, especially from an African point of view, would be worth fitting into many years down the road. And I think that will go back to your point on anthropological studies and anthropological issues. And definitely my last point would be 10 years from now, the role of technology cannot be underestimated. So definitely different forms of technology will come into play, and mobile money will I would think 10 years into it might be the main form of the transfers. Even within the Productive Safety Net program, they're already piloting in a few regions the use of mobile money. But that would also raise other issues again, because if you're targeting the poorest and if you want to bring a gender component, how many of the women have access to the mobile phones? If at all you're going to be moving to technology, what's the access to these technologies? Because that would probably raise another funding component, because if you want to move them towards technology, then you need to start by first providing them with the technologies for you to move into that way as a form of financing. So, those are just things running in my head, I guess.
Okay. And Paul?
Yeah, before I do that, I just wanted to say, point people in the direction of 3 or 4 studies that I think would be helpful, that I meant to mention in my talk. So, on the sort of gendered impacts of cash, the best thing I've read recently is the ODI review, Cash, What Does the Evidence Say, by Franziska Schwartz, which really effectively sort of mainstreams throughout the findings the differentially gendered impacts of cash across sort of different sectors and outcomes. So if you're interested in cash and gender, do read that. Also good on there, and a bit out of date, is a specific case study in Lesotho by Rachel Slater and Mfali looking at cash in Lesotho. I shouldn't tell you about this because I'm not meant to, but so we did a review for DFID of the controversy around cash in Lebanon. at a moment in time in June, and the debate's moved on since then. They've sat on it for a while. It's now published, although they've asked us to sort of publish it in secret. So you can get it on the you can get it on the HPM website, but we're not meant to tell anyone about it. But I just have, so don't tell Diff I told you. It's intended to be a really sort of neutral review of what happened and what the controversies were in Lebanon, rather than expressing our point of view around it. If you're interested in nutrition and cash, then there's a bunch of good stuff. One of the good things is Sarah Bailey and Karen Headland, who looked at nutrition and cash 3 or 4 years ago, and it's a really good summary of the potential impacts of cash on nutrition outcomes. And there's a more recent one that I've forgotten. And on the cash debate, just out a month or so ago, is a really good IDS paper looking at cash plus in social protection, but it is a really interesting framework for thinking about cash plus more generally, by Katie Rowland and Stephen Devereux. What cash will look like in 27? So the short answer is, of course, who knows? And it's very much up in the air, and there's a battleground around it, and it could play out in different ways. But that's a dull thing to say, so I will predict it. Cash will hit about 10 billion of a slightly reduced humanitarian spend, about 20 billion, because Syria will finally have been starting to be sorted out. DFID will have tiptoed into cash where they're directly contracting the private sector, and tiptoed back out of it again. WF, to the extent there's a race between agencies to see who does big cash best, WFP will have won, and it will be the sort of dominant actor. Lots of NGOs will have tried. A lot of them have fallen by the wayside. They'll have gone back to being more non-governmental and looking at the sort of different functions they can contribute in the sort of overall space, the sort of soft functions that people talk about within the sort of value chain around cash. Someone will have nailed the sort of, I'm not quite sure what I mean by this, but sort of direct peer-to-peer sort of social network aspect of cash. So me as an individual, I can send my cash directly to a named person in a disaster-affected country with someone operating that network, and it'll be a sort of child sponsorship reinvented in a way to directly get cash to people, and whoever nails that will have a really exciting position in the marketplace, that's it. The government-led safety nets and shock-responsive safety nets, and stronger, more assertive sovereign governments will continue to be a really important part of the picture.
Great, thank you. I'm sure you'll all join with me in thanking Isabel, Linda, Tahir and Paul for their contributions this morning. Thank you very much.